This is Life Worlds, the place where we explore life through other eyes and minds. Let's flip the script and discover how to orient your world around nature. I'm Alexa Permanish. Come join me as we get down and forage for fungi, stalk coyotes, draft laws for rivers, hum with beehives, sing bird language, and help beavers to dam again. Let these stories spark your reconnection to nature's multiverse. Learn how to bring ecosystems back to life, become an agent for other intelligences, and begin to see how you too are the sum of all life worlds. Hi everyone. So it was in August 1997 that the world's leading science journal called Nature published a cover story. It was titled The Wood Wide Web, and it was based on cutting-edge research by Dr. Suzanne Simard, who is a forest ecologist at the University of British Columbia and the daughter and granddaughter of loggers in the British Columbia rainforest. And her research showed how forest ecosystems distribute and share resources via the fungal webs, which are the mycorrhizal fungi networks that lie below our feet. Suzanne and her team found that these webs connected many different trees together in a mutualistic relationship, meaning a cooperative relationship. Exhibiting the same pattern language, I sort of see as almost like a biological neural network. You have nodes, you have neurotransmitters, you have synapses. This is not their language, but more mine. The fungi depend on the trees for carbon, and in turn, they wire the trees together, sort of like a nice little quid pro quo. And for those of us who have always intuited that the forest is indeed more than the sum of its parts, and then it must be engaging in some form of cooperation, well, this was finally the moment that science could prove what had been felt. Many people wrote in to Suzanne thanking her for confirming what they'd known in their hearts, that the forest is a connected and intelligent system. And of course, for local peoples in the world's indigenous communities, this was Western science, the little brother-sister, finally catching up with what their science had long held and known. In later years, Suzanne went on to an even more beautiful discovery, which was that the biggest, oldest trees in the forest, the mother trees, act as the energetic keystones of the whole system, the hubs, if you will, of the underground mycorrhizal networks. Using isotopes and molecular genetics, she showed how the older, stronger mother trees sustain the younger ones and foster deep resilience in ecosystems. And you can imagine the crowns of these trees, so that's the branching sort of canopy structure, the top of these trees, are like the forest's energy centers, carrying out photosynthesis and then redistributing energy down into smaller trees and saplings through the mycelial roots. They also found that trees recognize their relatives and benefit from growing near them. Older trees connect with and nurture younger siblings. And they are, of course, the genetic futures of the forest. As we'll touch on a bit today, naming these mother trees, mother, quote unquote, brought quite a strong backlash from the scientific community. And this leads to a whole conversation around anthropocentrism, femininity, patriarchy, and who gets to belong and say what in the halls of science. Taken together, her work overturns the old story of the forest as a collection of competing individuals. A forest is a complex adaptive system where interdependence is an essential feature that allows life to thrive. This is the beauty of adaptation and what we can call niche complementarity, a niche being the little space that you carve out for yourself as an ecosystem organism and what you do there. So you can think that, for example, cedar trees and maple trees draw on different pools of calcium and magnesium, or animals move through and scatter seeds and spores. And as we'll hear today, salmon carried up from the sea by bears and wolves leave their decaying bodies to feed the mycelium and feed the trees, actually meaning that the richest carbon pools on Earth can be found in these salmon forests. All of this also begs the question, well, if forests can cooperate like this and do, maybe humans could be no different to that. I had the great privilege of interviewing Suzanne this year in London at the MOTH, More Than Human Life Festival of Ideas, run by NYU Law's MOTH program, which is an awesome gathering that brought together voices from law, science, art, storytelling, advocacy, and really is beginning to represent the growing movement transforming legal, cultural, and political relationships with nature. In this vein as well, in a multidisciplinary lens, Suzanne conducts much of her research in partnership with First Nations communities, and with them is examining how climate change and forestry can reshape ecosystems. She's published over 200 scientific papers, written the New York Times bestseller that I highly recommend called Finding the Mother Tree, and has just published a new book called When the Forest Breathes, and has been named one of Time 100's most influential people. In this live conversation, we focus on the field itself, because behind every tidy paper, there is grueling and intense fieldwork. Suzanne has been called the Indiana Jones of science, and we'll maybe hear why. We talk about what it takes to do the science well and the many avenues of change she has walked, from the economy of carbon and biodiversity credits to storytelling, to standing on the front lines at Fairy Creek, which has been the largest act of civil disobedience in Canadian history. And at the heart of the conversation today are the findings from her latest book, where she shares her discoveries from the Mother Tree Project, which is now 10 years in and is one of the largest forestry experiments in Canada. Very briefly about it, because I think it's quite cool. Across 9 research sites spanning a climate gradient the size of Denmark, Suzanne and her team have been trialing 5 different ways of harvesting and retaining trees. For example, full clear cut versus partial cut, etc., and watching how the ecosystem responds. The aim of this is asking whether we can better emulate natural forest disturbance in our harvesting practices. And the findings are quite startling. Whole tree logging, it turns out, doesn't just take the carbon above the ground, it strips away up to 60% of the forest floor itself, which is ancient carbon that's taken thousands and thousands of years to build since the last ice age. And yet, they've also found that if we leave some legacy trees behind, that same forest floor begins to regenerate within just 2 to 3 years. The forest, given half a chance, knows how to come back. Without further ado, here is our episode with Suzanne. Suzanne, it is such a joy to be speaking with you today. You are indeed the scientist that has transformed the ways that thousands, if not millions of people think about forests. And dare I also say, you have been such a bridge of cultural translation between core science and the bravery of using terms like mother tree and the wood wide web. And I think that your impact is not just within the scientific community, but actually in society at large. And so it is such a delight to be here with you today.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here for me too.
So before getting into the weeds of the science and the implications of what the Mother Tree Project and the work from your latest book has for climate change, the climate crisis, and forestry practices around the world, please bring us into the field, because one of the things I experienced when I was reading your books, and I think I love this, like you've been dubbed the Indiana Jones of science. And it's true, you have found yourself in the most dangerous, astounding conditions. So what's it like to do the work that you do? What's it like to get into the field? And, the data is all pretty in a paper, but actually behind the data is a lot of chaos.
I mean, so many adventures. And I thought, well, could I tell a little story about being in the forest, one of those adventures? And I think it was my first realization of the mother tree. And I was actually in my early 20s, and I'd been working for a logging company. And keeping in mind, those logging companies are basically clear-cutting the last of our forests in British Columbia. This is still going on. And I became part of this industry after having grown up in forests, thinking that I was actually a tree and my grandfather was a river. So then being part of this machine, and I was taking a holiday one weekend, and my friend Jean and I, who figures in these books, were up in the Lillooet Mountains near Lytton in Enclamamex territory. So this is ancient, of course, Indigenous territory. At the time, we decided to go hiking, and we were going up into this valley. And we were in the dry belt Douglas fir forest, which ended up being where I did most of my research in the later years. I knew these forests really well. And we were climbing up into this valley, and we were heading for the highest peaks because it was going to be my 22nd birthday, and I wanted to celebrate my birthday up in these highest peaks. And we get up, and we're going up and up and up in this old miner's cabin. We pass and we go, but first of all, we were not really paying a lot of attention at first. So we had passed this rock down in the Stein, it was called the Stein River Valley, that turned out to be called an asking rock. And at the asking rock in Entlemac's mythology is that you're supposed to ask permission if you can go into this valley, which we hadn't done. So we're climbing up into this hanging valley, and we start to see evidence of bears. And we were going along this roaring river, and you can't hear very much, right? You can only hear the river. The river is speaking to us, and it's roaring. It's going roar. And I said to Jean, it's kind of noisy in here. We might not be able to hear much other than the river. And Jean says, oh, it's all right. And so we go along, and pretty soon we see these claw marks on these trees. And I said, I think that's a grizzly bear. And Jean says, yeah, but it'll be okay. We'll just keep going. And then we keep going, and pretty soon we see uprooted plants along the trail. And I said, Jean, I think the bears are here. I think they're trying to tell us something. And so we listened, and we turned around, and we went back down the mountain, and we ended up staying overnight in this little cabin. And then during the night, there was this big sound, and it was just a mouse. But it was a big sound. And then the next morning, there was like this strong odor. There were all these sounds and smells and signs. And we thought, we need to go. We hadn't realized we should have asked to come. And we go down the mountain, and, we're getting into more open territory. And all of a sudden, Jean, who was in front of me, who was always the strongest hiker, stops dead in her tracks. And I'm like, boom, I go right into her back. And I said, what's going on? She goes, there's a mother grizzly. And so right in front of her, only 6 feet away, was this mother grizzly with 2 cubs. And so I'm like, okay, right? She says, well, here's what we're going to do. And I said, what? She says, well, I'm climbing up this tree, and you're going to climb up that tree. And so she starts climbing up her tree, and she's going up and up and up and up. And so I'm climbing up my little tree too, up and up and up. But my tree is a lot smaller than her tree. And meanwhile, Mama Bear had sent her cubs up this other tree, climb, scratch, way up into the crown. And I'm going up my tree. All 4 of us are in trees now. And my tree is starting to go back and forth. And I can see Mama Bear going, every time I come over towards her mouth. So we sat in those trees for a long, long time. It seemed like hours. I think it was only an hour, but it was enough time for us all to go, it's all going to be okay. Even the bears, it's all going to be okay. And so Mama Bear, she was in control of this whole scene, right? So she's like, okay, you guys stay over here. You cubs, you stay over here. And then she's calling the shot. She's like, okay, cubs, it's time to come down. So we hear this coming down the tree, and then silence. And then we hear a little bit later rocks coming down the mountain. And Jean's going, it's time to go. And I'm like, I don't think it's time to go. And she says, well, we're going. And so she starts climbing down the tree. And so then I'm like, okay, well, I don't want to be left here by myself. So I start climbing down my tree. And we get down to the bottom. Our packs are still there. And Jean pulls on her pack, and she says, okay, we're going to be fine. Let's go. And so we start running down the trail, talking to the bears, going, we're leaving. We're out of here. We're going to ask next time. And sure enough, they had left, and we were all fine. So it was actually that big Douglas fir that Jean had climbed up that was she was the mother tree, and the mother bear was being the mother bear, and the mothers in this scene were in charge, and they made sure that we were all okay.
A big lesson is always ask permission, right?
Always ask permission, and if the answer is no, then you don't go, and if it's yes, then you can go.
One of the things that marked me in your book is Suzanne has to escape fires, and then you planted across a landscape the size of
Denmark, practically, hundreds of thousands of trees. And so just massive respect for such grueling work under such dangerous and really uncomfortable conditions. And something I'm really compelled to ask you is like, what does it take for you to do this kind of science well? Because what's the role of, let's say, intuition or sensing in the field? What's the role of, the grids that you come from science? Like, what are the ways of knowing that actually have you and your team do this successfully?
Yeah, so working in forests means that everything is really big and it takes a long time. And working in the field, in the forest, has got all kinds of uncertainties and unknowns and unexpected things that happen. So you kind of have to, in a way, you have to plan for that.
Like plan for the unplannable?
Plan for the unplannable. And the unplannable comes along. So I've set up this project called the Mother Tree Project, which spans a 1,000-kilometer climate gradient. And the reason I did it is that I wanted to take the knowledge that I had gathered through my decades of research on mother trees, on connection in the forest, on these underground networks, and apply it in the real world. Because in Canada, like I said, we're continuing to do the same thing that we've done for the last 100 years, at least the corporate Canada, which is to clear cut our forests, and which is the antithesis of what the mother trees are trying to tell us. They're trying to tell us that we are the energy centers of the forest. We are the genetic future of these forests. You need to keep us, not take all of us. And so I set up this experiment across this climate gradient, looking at ways that we could keep these old legacies in the forest. There are 9 experimental forests in this big experiment. Each one is about 100 hectares in size, where we're trying 5 different ways of retaining these old trees, and then watching just the forest grow on its own, and then looking at what do you do if you take them all away. And we are finding amazing things. But along the way, like you said, there are so many things that can go wrong. So keeping in mind not only the size, but the length of these experiments are huge. The oldest trees in this experiment are 500 years old. So I think of it as a 500-year-long experiment. How do you do a 500-year experiment? It's really hard. You have to have the next generations come along and look after it after you. And you also have to plan for the unexpected. So I'll just give a couple of examples of our 9 forests that we've labored over for 10 years, and we're just starting to get the results after 1 decade of setting this experiment up, is that one of our sites, our driest site that is at the most extreme end of the climatic gradient, the entire thing burned to the ground 2 years ago. The entire experiment that, is a standalone experiment as part of this gradient that we'd already spent, probably $500,000 getting it set up, and it burnt to the ground. Another one, 2 replicates blew down in a windstorm. Another one, a whole replicate burned down. Other ones, where some of the logging that was done in order to create these patterns, they overlogged. So you have to be patient. You have to turn lemons into lemonade sometimes. So what we've done is we've actually taken advantage of these great disturbances, these unexpected things, and we're studying them.
Does that same requirement for patience translate into when you interact with the forestry industry and how you're trying to convince them to change their practices based on your science?
Yes. So there's so many layers to the forest industry. There's people, and there's corporations, and there's governments, and there's many levels of governments. The people on the ground, they understand the forest, right? They do their work, they live in the forest. Just like I've lived in the forest my whole life. They know those forests. And they love them, right? Because people have this incredible intuitive sense about these wild places. They want to protect them. But then they're working for the corporation, which the corporation is not a person. It's an entity that's financed, that's bottom line is to make money and to report to the shareholders. And so these people are in this bind constantly to serve the forest while serving the corporation. And they can't do it. So they end up compromising their values. And so I can talk to them and they'll say, I get that, Suzanne, that we need to leave these trees behind, but I'm getting paid by the corporation. And then there's the governments who are supposed to regulate the corporations. But the government is going, well, we're broke. We have to fund our schools. We have to fund our hospitals. And so therefore we need to cut down the forest. And so then it becomes this positive feedback loop. And I have to say that in Canada, we're in that positive feedback loop. You know, it's not a positive outcome. It's an outcome that's very damaging. And so, yes, the people on the ground get it, but there's all these other layers that are driving us in this direction that grates against our very intuition and our what's inside of us.
So you had this 1997 famous Nature paper that was the Wood Wide Web, and, you know, everything below our feet is alive and entangled, and actually trees share resources between tree species, with kin. We have these mother trees. Their canopy are like the photosynthetic crowns of the entire forest. Since that paper and that science, and now with some of the findings from your book around the clear cutting practices, and I'm trying to keep this also practical, and we can weave between some of the more philosophical angles of the work, but just in the practical, how has that changed people's awakening, and has the public awakening itself managed to shift some of the ways that other people are interacting with how we do forestry?
Yeah, I mean, I think that people feel naturally, they feel akin to this understanding that the forest is a connected place, that it's whole and integrated. It's a holistic spiritual place. I think anybody here, probably most people here, would know that. You would know that when you walk in the forest, you can feel it. We felt that this morning when we were just even imagining the forest. And so the response from the public has been incredible, because I think that they feel heard, right, in a sense, that the voice that is inside of them has been listened to. And all I'm really doing is translating the voice from the forest to the person who's being heard. And so they, you know, the public is on board. I shouldn't even say on board. The public, you know this. When it comes to forest practices and that corporate entity that has not a person, that translation gets lost. And so that as money is still speaking, is the dominant voice in the forest, in what we do in forests. And so, yes, people get it. Yes, even the foresters get it. Yes, even the politicians get it. But there's this other thing going on that is much bigger than them. And so we have the same practice going on over and over and over again, to where in British Columbia, the last of the last of the last old growth is still falling today. But I really think that we're all here, right? We're all listening to this and going, what can I do? What can I do? Well, there's so much. This is what you can do. You've come here and you're listening, and you're an emergent thing, and you're thinking together with new ideas. And this is going to get translated. It's going to end up flying across the Atlantic Ocean into the ears of the politicians. And they're going to start regulating. So I feel like, we've been moving along like this, and it's almost imperceptible, no change, and then there's change. And I feel like we're on the cusp of change.
And so much of this is storytelling, right? And I think what so many people in this room are doing. And so the science gives credibility and permission, which it shouldn't. We should, as you said, First Nations have known this since time immemorial. People intuitively know the forest is alive and interconnected. But we're still in this awkward system where there's this tension where, we need the science to kind of show or prove or give permission. Then there's public, let's say, the public warms to this notion, right? Why did you choose the language that you did? Was that intentional, like Wood Wide Web, Mother Tree? And for other people here who are working on similar spaces in the environmental movement, what's your advice on, the communication, the language that moves people's hearts and minds? And it's an act of bravery, I have to say, both you and Monica and others who have stepped out of the norm. Not many people do that.
It's been hard. It's a double-edged sword. Well, first of all, to clarify the Wood Wide Web part, so I published in Nature that birch and fir and cedar are in communication. I didn't call it communication at the time. I called it, resource transfer, because that language of communication, I think I would have been pushed right out of the scientific community at that point. So I didn't dare go there then. But the Wood Wide Web was a name coined by Nature, the journal Nature. It wasn't me, right? I would never even have called it with the Wood Wide Web. I was so young. I was 13 30 years old. And how brave that would have been of me to do that. But there's no way I would have done that then. I was still enmeshed in this very colonial, capitalistic, scientific endeavor and in the industry as well, and trying to fight my way through. But nature took it on themselves and they named it the Wood Wide Web, which was interesting because at that time, that's when the World Wide Web was just being invented. That's how old I am, by the way. But language is so important. And then the mother tree. Oh my God. So if the Wood Wide Web had backlash, that was like a little ripple in the ocean. The mother tree created a tsunami of backlash because the language, still even today, the language is not acceptable in the Western scientific world, right? If I'd written that it was a hub tree in graph theory, which is how we sort of identified these central trees, it would have been no problem, right? But the mother tree, oh my God.
So what do you think from your latest book, and it's When the Forest Breathes, and I highly recommend, maybe we'll have time to read a beautiful passage from it after. What in this book do you think might create that same language shift, or like what's the equivalent of the mother tree in this book that's going to ruffle people?
Well, I've got some exciting news, I think, even that's emerged since I wrote this book. One of the main things I wanted to convey, there are a couple of things. One is that we are the forest. We are the relations of the trees and the animals and the water and the soil. And that, and my Indigenous colleagues have been showing and demonstrating this for thousands of years. And I brought that into the experiment and into the book. So that was one goal. But the other goal was to demonstrate what is it that colonial forestry is doing to these forests. And of course, I'd been, leaving these old trees behind. But what I didn't anticipate was that when we logged the forest to leave trees behind in different patterns and configurations and densities, that the logging practices had changed, in the recent past. Like industry moves along and we don't even notice that it's actually becoming more and more aggressive and in their name efficient. So in that name of efficiency, economic efficiency, the machines had gotten huge. And they had turned to this process called whole tree logging, where you actually pull the entire tree out of the forest because it's cheaper than lopping off the branches in the forest, pull it to the edge of the landing, lop off the branches there, haul those logs away on logging trucks, and then burn the big piles of branches and whatever else you've managed to drag through the forest, which includes all the dens and nests and lizards and squirrels and nutrients on those branches and lichens and mosses and everything is gone.
It's an ecocide event. I mean, it's just...
It looks like that. And so when we started counting what happened, what we discovered is that and we were counting carbon because carbon is 50% of a tree and it's easy to count. And it's a really good indicator of forest health or productivity. It's not the only one, but it's a good one. Turns out it's fungible as well in the economy. But what we found was that, of course, with clear cutting, all of the above ground carbon is gone. Boom. Zoop, gone. Right? And it's turned into logs and sent away and turned into pulp or cardboard boxes that are shipped around by Amazon around the world, or into some of it into lumber. So, but the vast majority ends up poof in the atmosphere within 1 year. Gone. What we didn't anticipate was that the forest floor, where the other half of the carbon pool is, it's below ground, that the forest floor, which is where those mycelial networks exist, where the roots exist, there you go, 60% of it was also gone. And this is devastating because that forest floor took, since the last ice age, to build 10,000 years. It's ancient carbon. And so if we evaporate that with a logging practice that is not thought through very well, we're degrading the landscape. But we have other news too.
I mean, what strikes me about that is like the absolute compression and like twisting of time that does, right? Like millions and billions of years in one event, just gone. There's a part of your book I wanted to read which speaks about the clear cut. How many people in this room have experienced a clear cut in the flesh? Yeah, it's something that you will never turn back from. So this is just from this book, but you should read this. It's this part.
Yes, okay. I've been to many, many clear cuts, but The landscape felt like a graveyard. No birds sang, no leaves trembled in the breeze, creeks were choked with soot. I felt a hollowness in my chest. A million wild voices had been silenced. A zombie fire would continue to burn below ground through the winter.
I mean, this is what's at stake, right? And something else that really struck me with the book, and I visited in Finland. It was one of the world's most sustainable forestry companies because they leave some trees standing. But these are like lone, skinny trees amidst just debris of dead beings. And this is like one of the world's best forestry. And I'm not a scientist necessarily, but it doesn't take a genius to see that one lone tree is not a forest. And you speak about that in these studies that you do, where actually the best in class forestry tries to leave some trees, but it's a semblance, it's a shell of a forest. I mean, it's a forest, it's not actually a forest, right?
Yeah, it's complicated. As we've been talking about here, there is a much bigger world out there that is working really hard to mend these places. And we need to do our part to help them do that mending. And so, yes, you're right. Like if we leave a tree, which is considered sustainable in Finland, by the way, I'm 1/4 Finnish, so I've never been there, but thank you, Finland. Even one tree is better than no trees. But what we're finding in our research is that that single tree by itself is a lonely tree. Who are they going to speak with? And they go into a shock, when all their neighbors have been taken away. Like you would go into shock if you lost all your family and friends and your whole community. They go into shock. And what we're finding is within 5 years that the vast majority of them die. But in that little period before they die, they do a lot of good work. They go into a stress response and they set a lot of seed. And those cones are flourishing and the seed disperses and their youngsters come up in their understory before they go. So that's a really good thing. The other thing that those lone trees do is they're trying to fix carbon through photosynthesis, and they send it to their roots and they support the food web even as they're dying. And that food web goes, thank you, and starts to decay and decompose the remains of that forest. And so what we found is that even after 3 years, even after 5 years, we've gone back and we've measured how the forest is recovering. Even when those lone trees are dead, what they've done is they've engendered the recovery of the forest. And then the plants that are coming up to take the place of the trees, the salmonberries, the huckleberries, the mosses and lichens that eventually come in, that they start to decompose that wood and they use the energy from the soil food web and they rebuild the forest floor. And we're finding that even after 3 years, when we've lost 60% of the forest floor, that we find that 20% of that has come back within 3 years. That's the more than human world doing its good work.
That reminds me of the salmon that you speak of in many of your books, which they're dying flesh. Maybe you can speak about that relationship between the salmon and the trees for those who don't know, but like the ultimate act of generosity being your body, being the food for the next that comes.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just going to finish that last little thought and we'll come back to the salmon. But the lone trees dying. If we leave a cluster of trees, if we leave a continuous cover of trees and thin out from below, those trees love their neighbors. And after 5 years, they're still there. So we can do this other little act of not taking 99%, but maybe taking only 70%. Even better, only take a small portion, just thin out from below, and that forest is still there, is able to recover, and we can still get things, our needs met from the forest. And coming into the salmon story, this is an act in our part. If we do this, if we listen to what the forest is telling us, and if we act on that knowledge, that we can actually be good stewards and create wealth in these forests. And we can still have our needs met. So the salmon story is a beautiful example of this. So along the west coast of Canada and the United States especially, but the North Pacific Northwest, there are the indigenous people. So that would include many nations from the Haida, the Tsimshian, the Heiltsuk, the Nuxalk, the Guaganuk, the Kwakwaka'wakw Nuchanoth people, the Coast Salish people. They would build what are called tidal stone traps. Tidal stone traps is a fishing technology that's ancient. And where the estuaries are, where salmon go to spawn, they would build these long strokes of stone walls to fish the salmon. So the way they work is that during spawning season in the fall, the salmon will come in to go to spawn. And then on the ebb tide, when the tide goes out, some of those salmon get trapped behind. And it's on the ebb tide that the people would then passively fish. They would take the fish and dry them and store them for winter food. And in that process, what they're doing is they're actually selecting fish. So they always let the big mothers and fathers go upstream to spawn and fertilize and lay their eggs and produce bigger fish for the future. So that's one thing. That's a really good practice. The second thing is they count the fish. So in counting the fish, they're basically asking permission and responding to that and saying, if there's not enough fish, we won't fish. We won't harvest this year. We'll just let this go and we'll harvest other food. So there's a great deal of technology then in this fishing, these tidal stone traps. And my understanding, working with fisheries salmon scientist Dr. Teresa Ryan, who is Simshan, is that the salmon abundance actually increased along the West Coast because of these and other practices, a reciprocal practice based on monitoring and knowledge. So then the salmon would go upstream and spawn. Those big fish, the fry, would emerge in the springtime, but in the fall, waiting for those salmon are the bears and the wolves and the eagles. And they would carry the salmon into the forest. And Teresa and I and our students would follow these fish up the streams and then watch and see where the grizzlies would take them into the forest. And sure enough, you go in, and when you get into those estuaries, they're covered in salmon carcasses in the spring, because the bears, when they take them into the forest, they don't eat, most of it they don't eat. They leave most of it behind. They're only looking after very specific parts of the fish, the roe, the brains, the guts, the high nutrient parts of the fish. So most of it is left in the forest floor. And so when you're walking there, you're practically slipping over big swaths of decaying salmon. So imagine that, right? A thick bed of salmon. The bears have taken it in there. And then what happens to that decaying salmon is it decays and seeps into the soil. And then the mycorrhizal network, or the mycelium, picks up those nutrients and delivers them right into the tree. And so these trees are full of salmon. So is the soil. And it also changes the entire soil food web. The species are different because they're used to salmon. Another part of this story is that, of course, these great big trees are shading the streams, which makes it nice and it regulates the temperature. We're measuring temperature changes between clear cuts and under the canopy. And in the summer, it's a 10 degrees Celsius difference on the hottest days. So that makes the difference between life and death for these creatures. They are born, they go out, and they carry out their life cycle. We've also been monitoring carbon pools in these salmon forests. It turns out that the carbon pools on Haida Gwaii, especially on Haida Gwaii, are the richest carbon pools that are actually reported in the literature that I have seen of all the forests in the world. And it's because of that beautiful cycle between the people, the bears, the wolves, the more than human world, the salmon, the water, the forest, and they're enriching these environments and basically then stabilizing our climate.
Would it be very radical to say that the forest itself is one organism? I mean, it's all fractal like Gaia, but do you and your colleagues come to see the forest more as one entity in a way with all of these different beings? Yeah.
Yes, it is. I mean, it's kind of interesting as a scientist trained in the Western world. It's like, oh, don't say that, Suzanne. I can hear the critics. Don't say that. We don't have enough evidence that it's all connected together. But it is, right? Just open our eyes. It is.
It's a good crowd. It's a good crowd. By the way, before we came on stage, I asked Suzanne what was around her neck, but I think it's a beautiful moment to bring it in.
This, if you can see this is a cedar pendant that was given to me by Kuang Lisa White, who is a Haida Raven's Tail weaver. She works with me on Haida Gwaii, and it's actually a salmon egg, and there's a little salmon fry inside of the egg. And so it's a symbol of our co-creation together of this work, and a hopeful sign of the future of the next generations still being here.
So I don't know why this is coming up, but actually I want to speak to you about protest. Because in the brief moment I lived in British Columbia, I remember that you were basically like a celebrity going to the middle of the protest lines and working with all of these First Nations and sort of settler culture activists on the front line of the largest demonstration, civil demonstration in Canada's history, I believe, which was at Fairy Creek. And they were about to log one of the last remnants of old growth of Vancouver Island. So I'm curious about all these avenues of change and where, from what you saw on the ground in British Columbia, which is its own context, what did you learn about activism and the different voices that show up in that context and all of even the conflicts that occurred within communities? Because within communities, some people want to log, some don't. So just kind of, bring us into that.
It's so complex, but I hope that we can simplify it in a way. You know, I've been on the front lines with my research and trying all the ways that I can to help protect the forests that I grew up in. I mean, these are the places that I love, right? I grew up in these wild, old places. And in my lifetime, I've seen them disappear to where we've only got, like I said earlier, 2 to 3% of our tall treed ecosystems left. And so can you imagine, as a person, as you watch your home being cut down, and the last of the last is under the saw, you know, it's going to be cut down. So Fairy Creek is under threat right now. I'm supposed to go next week with a journalist and go, okay, where are we at now? And so when you're watching that disappear, which we're all doing, right? You do everything you can. And so I've tried in so many ways, every avenue. I've done the science. Okay, the science was great. It shows connection. You know, we need to keep the big old trees, the mother trees. I named them mother trees. I went out on a limb and named them the mother tree. Okay, then that didn't really work, right? We're still cutting down the old forests. Well, maybe it's working. So then you go, okay, what do I do next? Well, maybe it's the economy. Maybe we got to, start measuring carbon pools in these forests. And if we count them up and we say, actually, you can, if you leave things behind and you cut some things, you can make a good economy. And we showed that. We proved that. We have excellent evidence that you can do that if you combine some harvesting with carbon credits and biodiversity credits. You can actually make more from that than just logging the forest. So we tried that too.
And jobs, which was critical in your book, yeah.
Right, which creates more jobs because you have to do more careful harvesting in order to, protect those existing legacies. Okay, so, this week I'm getting a call from my good friend Rachel Holt, who is a policy activist, and she said, Suzanne, they're going for the last of the last. They've accelerated the logging now. And so then you go, okay, well, what do we do next? You did the science, you wrote the book, you put your name out there, you got backlash, and then, okay, well, and you try to move the economy, you talk to the politicians. Well, what do you have left? You go put your body on the line, right? You go protest. And I'm saying all these things because not to say that any one of them is the answer, they're all the answer. Every single thing that we do matters. And so the activism at Fairy Creek, I joined over 1,000 people who were arrested in that place to protest the logging of the last old growth forest on southern Vancouver Island. It was very complex because so many people ended up being pitted against each other in trying to save this last forest. At the end of the day, the forest is still standing, so that's a success. Yay. Yeah. There's another arrow in the quiver, which is César's, which is the law, right? It's completely legal to clear cut the forests of British Columbia. In fact, it's illegal not to clear cut the forests of British Columbia. We need to change the laws, and we need to change them even more so that the forest has rights. So those are many, many things. I probably 10 things that we can do. Activism is one of them.
I'm conscious that there's many directions in which we can go, and I actually feel like maybe the audience can guide where we can go in this conversation. I'd love to hear people's voices and maybe gather 3-4 questions and then see if there's a pattern. And I saw a hand up over many hands in the orange.
Thank you. It was the word mother that sparked such backlash. And I'm curious from your position how you see the role of femininity, the role of patriarchy in this perhaps cusp of change?
Holy. So the first question was about change and how do I feel about the change coming up? And I really think that, we're rapidly heading in the wrong direction while at the same time we're heading in the right direction. It's like a mycorrhizal network where the nutrients go back and forth, the carbon moves back and forth between the trees. But we need to keep running as fast as we can in that other direction while trying to pull the more destructive forces with us. It's going to take all of us, honestly, and it's going to take all over the world. But I think that I'm hopeful. And yet, I'm tired. It's your life, right? So when I get back to British Columbia, I have a walk in the forest with the Premier of British Columbia. I'm going to tell him what I think. I prearranged this months ago. We're going to go to a clear cut in an old growth forest, and I'm going to say, David, this has got to stop. Right, and you just keep, and he won't be able to, but you just keep going. And then if voices from here around the world move towards him because he's got a heart and he listens, that if there's enough, he's going to hear it and there will be change. And so it's just keep going, keep going. Okay, the other question. Yeah, women play a really important role here, and so do men. It is a noticeable pattern that a lot of women are standing up and we're taking a lot of heat. Monica? Yeah. And it's hard. And we need support. And it seems like, why is it? Well, I think a couple things. Women, because we never really belonged in the patriarchy of science. I mean, we're trying to get in there, but because we're new learners, Monica described this so beautifully, that when you're a new learner and you don't have as much to lose, you're more open. And so we ask our questions that are more connected, integrated, networked. We're asking more feminine maybe questions, and then we get hit, but then we come back because we actually have each other. And we have an emerging movement that's growing. And it's not just us, it's many, many, many women, unseen voices all around the world. And we're getting support from men too, which is amazing, right? It's great. We need as much support as possible, and we need to support the men. It's got to be a reciprocal, integrated, all-together thing. But it's a real thing, right? It's real that the backlash against the mother tree was so strong. What if I'd called it a father tree? Would it have been different? I don't know. Or a parent tree. Actually, in genetics, they call them parent trees, and it's been accepted for a long, long, long time. But the mother tree, that's a different thing. But I want us to, let's keep using the language, And when I examine the language and I look at cultures around the world, that language has been around for a long, long time. Grandfather trees, grandmother trees, mother trees, father trees, daughter cell, family trees, all kinds. So we just keep using the language and then we get used to it and we go, oh yeah, we're all in this together, inclusive and we belong. There's many more things that could be said about your question, but yes.
Yeah, after hearing you and Monica Gagliano, the question that's been coming up for me is, I understand that conventional science is unfamiliar with these ways of thinking and uncomfortable with it. I still don't quite grasp why the intensity of the hostility. It's almost like some kind of fear of something. And given your experience, do you have anything to say about some of the things that might be driving the level of hostility that you've been encountering?
Of course, I've thought about this long and hard because the hostility has been long and hard. You're right. And I don't know all the answers. I think there's multiple things. I think that there is a hanging on to what is perceived as normal, especially in the scientific world. There's this accepted paradigm. It's a dominant Western paradigm. It's reductionist. And that reductionist approach to science is only validated. It's validated in the literature. Other ways of knowing is not, it's not readily accepted in journals or at all. And so the change in science is slow. And so, but people have to keep changing it themselves, right? Science is us. So there's the Western science part. There's also the whole industrial complex as well that doesn't want change in that scientific paradigm because it's been supported by science, right? If I look at forestry, I can speak to forestry. There's a huge amount of money that's been paid into scientific endeavors to support fast-growing forests so we can cut them down, to keep the industry going, to understanding how herbicides work and so that we can, keep fast-growing forests without, those darn huckleberries around them. The genetically modified organism industry. There's lots of industries that have been supported by this dominant scientific paradigm. So those forces come into play as well. And they're kind of invisible, but they're very, very tough. So yeah, those are just two things. And there would be other things too, but I'll just stop at that.
You're providing a real threat to an entire way of being. And that's very uncomfortable for people, I think. Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yes.
I couldn't help but notice that you were excited earlier to share something with us, and I just wanted to make sure that you shared it. You said that you had some new development or that something had happened since you wrote your last book or maybe during it, and I just didn't want us to leave here without learning what that was.
I guess there's a couple things that I think that the trees are trying to show me. And I'm going to, again, channel Monica, who keeps saying, I'm listening to the plants to tell me what to do. And so what they're doing, so there's two stories they're telling me right now that I need to follow up on. So one of them is, I did actually partially talk about it, which is that this devastating impact of industry on the forest floor, which is basically the birthplace of the next forest, that we're losing, 61% of it. And that the amazing thing that data was showing me is that it's growing back. I thought it was going to be gone, right? It took 10,000 years and within 2 or 3 years, it's coming back. That's a message saying that if we do our part by leaving some of those big trees behind to fuel the soil food web, and if we allow those plants to grow and take the place of some of the missing trees, because they do come back, they'll come up into those gaps, and we don't try to get rid of them, that we let them do their job, they're rebuilding that forest floor in a really rapid way. So that is as strong as a message coming to me from the forest as the wildfires that are also raging across Canada. Those are two strong voices. One is, hey, slow down. And the other one is, hey, you need to do your part and be the stewards of our forests.
I think that we're almost at time. Just maybe a final question for people here who don't live in Canada or who maybe do. Or how can people engage with this kind of work, with your organization? Or I'm just curious if people can leave with, you've already said, it takes all of us, and there's a multiplicity of ways we're all acting, but I'm curious if from the perspective of the forest, or along the lines of what you've just shared, if there's any other things that are coming to mind for you.
I think that your voices are really important. So if you hear negativity about the work that we try to do, speak up and say, hey, wait a minute, and support us. All of us, you're all here because you're part of this network. So we need to grow and keep our voices strong and keep shouting it out. That's one thing. Another thing is these experiments that we do are really important, right? You can do samples, you can model, you can project, you can do satellite imagery. There's all kinds of fancy tools and they're all important. But being on the land is the most important thing in my view. And doing these long-term experiments that cover 1,000 kilometers, it's hard to do and it's expensive to do and it takes dedication and generations of people to keep going. So getting involved in some way, whether it's being there or even creating some kind of media that says, oh, this is an important piece of work, or if you're a journal reviewer, that you give it a good fair review. If you're a funder, to provide funding, because it needs that, just like everything else. So just, there's so many ways. And I guess too, right, to be part of the movement to heal the planet. And there's so many ways that we can do that too.
Suzanne, thank you so much. Thank you for everyone who didn't get to ask a question, but you can mob Suzanne.
And so to conclude that episode, we may have heard claps and cheers from the crowd, because I think it's rare, right, that we clap and cheer on our scientists and our researchers. But I think you might appreciate the rarity it is to stand up and speak in this way in the scientific community. And Suzanne is doing so much work along with her allies in the First Nations to protect these primeval forests that are completely irreplaceable. And so I highly recommend you to check out all the links in the show notes and the resources and read the books and immerse yourself in this space where forest policy and practices really meets a much more spiritual aspect of the work. That's it for me for now. Over and out. Thank you as always for being here.